My name is Vivian Cole, and I am 36 years old. 20 minutes ago, my husband slid a single sheet of paper across our kitchen island and told me, in the same calm voice he uses to order steak, that he was taking the house, the kids, and everything else that had my name on it. I looked at the paper. It was a quitclaim deed. My signature line was empty, waiting. I picked up the pen he'd already uncapped for me, and I signed it without reading a single word. He blinked. He had expected tears. He had expected a fight, or at the very least a question, because I always ask questions. That's the whole reason he needed me handled tonight instead of consulted. Instead, I capped the pen, slid it back across the granite, and asked if he wanted me to notarize it myself, since I still kept my old stamp in the junk drawer. He did not understand why I was smiling. I want you to sit with that image for a second, because it's the whole story in miniature. A man who has just told his wife he's taking her house, her children, and everything else with her name on it, standing across a kitchen island, waiting for the tears he's rehearsed a response to, getting a small, calm smile instead, and having absolutely no framework for what that smile means. My phone buzzed on the counter between us. A text from my attorney, Grant Okafor, the man who had spent the last 3 weeks begging me, in increasingly urgent language, to slow down, to wait, to not do the one thing I was about to do. The message said, in full, Vivian, do not sign anything until we talk. Please call me the second you see this. I saw it. I didn't call him. Not yet. Because Marcus didn't know what I had already done 3 weeks earlier, on a Tuesday morning, before he woke up, before his coffee, before any of this. And in about 4 days, he was going to find that out in front of his own mother, his own lawyer, his girlfriend, and a title company employee named Renata, who had absolutely nothing to do with any of it and would nonetheless remember this particular Thursday for the rest of her career. Welcome back to Calm Karma Stories, where ordinary people face impossible family moments and walk out with their dignity intact. If you have ever been the one who quietly holds a family together while everyone else takes the credit, this story is for you. Drop a comment and be sure to subscribe. But let me back up. Let me take you to the morning 3 weeks before that kitchen island, because that's where this actually starts. Actually, let me back up further than that, because none of it makes sense without the 14 months before it. I need you to understand what I do for a living first, because it explains everything that comes after. I'm a senior risk analyst in the Fraud and Compliance Division at Ridgeline National Bank. For 11 years, my entire job has been noticing the thing that doesn't match. A wire transfer routed 1 hop too many. A signature that leans 2 degrees off the exemplar on file. A notary stamp with an expiration date nobody bothered to check before they used it. People imagine fraud gets caught by some dramatic red flag, a siren, an alarm bell. It almost never does. It gets caught by someone boring and patient noticing that an ordinary Tuesday looks slightly wrong, and then noticing it again and writing it down. I am that boring, patient person. I built a whole career on it, one flag discrepancy at a time. And every single morning, rain or shine, before I look at a single spreadsheet, I get the same coffee from the same shop 2 blocks from the branch. Black, no sugar, scalding hot, in a paper cup I hold with both hands like it's the only steady thing in the world some mornings. It's a habit from my very first job as a teller, back when I was 22 and terrified, and that coffee was the only part of my day I fully controlled. 11 years later, it still is. You're going to see that cup again. Remember it. It shows up every time I'm about to do something that requires me to be very, very calm. Marcus and I met when I was 29 at a mutual friend's engagement party, and he was charming in the specific way charming men are charming, which is to say he was extraordinarily good at making you feel like the only competent person in any room, right up until the moment it benefited him for you to feel small instead. He ran, or said he ran, a real estate investment company called Coastline Capital Partners. He talked about it constantly in our first year together, mostly in vague, confident phrases about verticals and positioning that sounded impressive and meant almost nothing. For most of our marriage, ran mostly meant he sat in a home office with the door closed and told me, when I asked, that the tax structure was complicated and I wouldn't understand it. Our wedding was small, 80 guests, a backyard, string lights, the kind of day I still think about fondly even now, which is its own strange thing to sit with. Diane cried during the vows and told everyone at the reception that she'd finally found the daughter she'd always wanted, someone steady, someone who'd keep her son organized. At the time, I heard that as love. Looking back, I hear it slightly differently. I hear a woman describing a role she was hiring me for. I remember thinking, at the time, that it was a lovely thing to say about a new daughter-in-law, and I danced with Marcus that night without a single doubt in my body about any of it. The first 2 years were genuinely happy ones, and I want to say that clearly, because this isn't a story where every single day was a warning sign I simply chose to ignore. We bought a starter condo, then the house, then had Eli, then Noah. Marcus was present for both births, took real time off work, learned to make the specific bland toast Eli would eat as a toddler, and absolutely nothing else. I'm telling you this because betrayal doesn't usually happen to a woman who was miserable the whole time and too foolish to notice. It happens, more often, to a woman who was genuinely happy for a long stretch and who had every reasonable reason in the world to extend trust to the person she'd built that happiness with. I let that stand for longer than I should have. That's the part that's hard to admit. Here's the family role I settled into, the one I didn't choose so much as absorb without noticing. I was the fixer. When Marcus's business account got flagged for an odd international wire 2 years into the marriage, I was the one who called the bank on my day off and untangled it before it became a real problem. When his mother, Diane, needed a co-signer for a used SUV because her credit had never recovered from an old bankruptcy, I was the one who read the loan terms line by line before anyone else in the family bothered to open the envelope. When our son Eli needed a specialist and our insurance denied the claim twice, I was the one who appealed it a third time at 11 at night until it finally went through. When Marcus's younger brother lost his apartment and needed somewhere to land for what was supposed to be 2 weeks and became 5 months, I was the one who set the house rules, kept the peace, and quietly covered his half of the groceries without ever mentioning it to Marcus, because Marcus hated conflict with his own family more than he hated almost anything else. Marcus called me his rock. Diane called me a godsend at every single holiday dinner, usually right before asking me to look over some paperwork of hers. What both of them meant, underneath the compliment, was simple. She'll handle it, so the rest of us don't have to think about it. And every single time I handled something, one phrase came back to me, from one or both of them, like a small bell rung to remind me of my place in this family. A good wife doesn't ask questions. Diane said it first, at our engagement dinner, when I asked Marcus a perfectly reasonable question about how Coastline was funded and whether he had outside investors. She said it warmly, like a gift she was handing me across the table. A good wife doesn't ask questions, dear. She trusts. I laughed it off then, 29 years old and in love and eager to be the kind of woman his family approved of. I didn't laugh it off the 4th or 5th time I heard it. The first crack came 2 years into the marriage, small enough that I told myself for months I'd imagined it. A statement from an account I didn't recognize arrived at our house by mistake, addressed to Marcus at a P.O. box I'd never once heard him mention. I asked him about it over dinner, gently, the way you'd ask about anything you were hoping had an easy explanation. He said it was nothing, an old business account he kept separate for liability reasons, and could I please not open his mail going forward? Diane, visiting that same week, patted my hand across the table and said it again, softer this time, like a lullaby. A good wife doesn't ask questions, Vivian. She trusts her husband to handle business. I let it go. I want to be honest about that, because I think it matters. I let a lot of things go for a long time because the alternative felt like accusing the people I loved most of, something I had no actual proof of yet. The second crack came 4 years in. I found a hotel charge on a card I managed for our household expenses, a downtown hotel 40 minutes from anywhere either of us had a reason to be on a Tuesday afternoon. When I brought it up, Marcus said it was a client meeting that ran long and that he'd stayed rather than fight rush our traffic home. It was plausible, barely. I filed it away, the way I file away every small anomaly at work, in the part of my brain that doesn't forget just because it stops talking about something out loud. The third crack came 6 years in, and this one I almost didn't survive emotionally, even though on paper it looked small. Diane, at a family barbecue in her backyard, mentioned offhand, over a plate of potato salad, that Marcus had told her Coastline was finally, quote, bringing on a real partner, someone with capital and connections. I asked, naturally, who that was, setting my own plate down so I could give the question my full attention. Marcus laughed, a little too quickly, and said his mother talked too much and it wasn't finalized yet, nothing worth discussing at a family cookout. Diane, sensing she'd stepped somewhere she shouldn't have, smiled at me and said, for the third time in our marriage, a good wife doesn't ask questions. Honey, it'll all come out when it's supposed to. She said it lightly, the way you'd say pass the ketchup, like it was a piece of ordinary hospitality rather than an instruction. I remember standing there in that backyard, in the heat, holding a paper plate of potato salad I no longer had any appetite for, and understanding, for the first time with any real clarity, that I had married into a family with a specific philosophy about women who ask questions, and that the philosophy was designed entirely around whichever man happened to be sitting at the head of the table that year. I started keeping a small, private list after that barbecue. Nothing formal. Just dates and details, jotted in a notes app under a folder labeled recipes, so I never had to explain it to anyone who glanced at my phone. The fourth crack, the one that finally mattered, came 14 months before that kitchen island. A colleague at the bank, running an unrelated compliance sweep, mentioned in passing that an LLC called Coastline Capital Partners had opened a business line of credit at our sister branch, and that the person listed on the account wasn't recorded as an owner or officer of the company in any state filing anywhere. She wasn't asking me to look into it. She was just making conversation over lunch. But that's the thing about being the person who notices what doesn't match. You can't unnotice it once you've heard it out loud. I pulled the public filings myself that same evening, on my own laptop, on my own time, the way anyone can. Coastline Capital Partners had 2 members listed, Marcus Cole, and a woman named Chelsea Whitfield, 31 years old, listed as co-managing member since 18 months earlier, a full 6 months before that hotel charge I'd filed away and tried to forget. I sat with that filing open on my screen for a long time that night, long after Marcus had gone to bed, assuming I was catching up on emails like I did most evenings. I want to be honest about what that moment actually felt like, because it wasn't the clean, composed clarity I probably make it sound like now, telling it to you after the fact. It felt like the floor tilting very slightly under a house I thought was level. I remember closing the laptop, sitting in the dark kitchen for a while, and then, almost involuntarily, getting up to check that the coffee filters were stocked for the morning, because some part of me needed one single thing in the house to still be exactly where I expected it to be. I didn't confront him that night. I want you to understand why, because it's the part people judge me for the most when I tell this story. I didn't confront him because I have spent 11 years learning that the moment you show your hand to someone who is already lying to you, they stop leaving evidence and start covering it instead. So I did exactly what I do at work when something doesn't match. I watched. I documented. I waited for the pattern to finish forming before I ever let on that I'd seen the first thread of it. Over the following months, quietly, methodically, I built what I would eventually start calling, only in my own head, the file. Let me tell you exactly what was in it, because I think the specifics matter more than the summary. Document 1. A bank statement he thought he'd permanently deleted from our shared cloud drive, but had only archived, showing transfers to an account with only his name on it. Document 2. A joint tax return from 2 years back, where a business deduction didn't match a single invoice I could find anywhere in his records. Document 3. A lease agreement for a storage unit I'd never heard of, paid monthly from that same isolated account. I found that one almost by accident, going through an old email folder looking for something completely unrelated, a receipt for a furnace repair, and noticing an auto-pay confirmation for a storage facility 20 minutes from our house, addressed to Marcus, dated back further than I expected. I drove past that facility once, on my lunch break, just to see it, though I never went in, never asked what was inside Unit 214. I didn't need to know what was in the box to know that a man who tells you everything doesn't need a storage unit his wife has never heard of. Documents 4 through 7. 4 separate wire transfers, each just under the $10,000 threshold that triggers automatic federal reporting requirements, moving steadily from an account with both our names on it into an account with only his. I recognized that pattern immediately because it's a pattern I have flagged for other people 100 times in my career. It's called structuring. It is a federal crime when you do it specifically to avoid reporting requirements. And by my careful count, Marcus had done it 4 times in 5 months. In my actual job, when I see 4 transactions that neat, that consistently just under a reporting line, from the same source to the same destination, I don't call it a coincidence. I call it a pattern, and patterns like that are exactly what the reporting threshold was designed to catch in the first place. It didn't matter that the person doing it happened to be sleeping 4 feet away from me every night. A pattern is a pattern. If you're keeping track of the numbers with me, stay with me, because it gets worse before it gets better, and I promise the ending is worth the wait. Subscribe now if you haven't, because the next part is the piece that turned this from a private hurt into something I could actually act on. I didn't tell anyone yet. Not my sister, not my closest friend, and certainly not Diane. I told my coffee cup, some mornings, standing alone in the bank parking lot before my shift, holding it with both hands, telling myself I still had time to be careful about this. Around that same time, something small happened that I only understood the real meaning of much later. We were out to dinner, the 4 of us, a rare night when Diane had the kids, so Marcus and I could have a date, and his card declined at the end of the meal. He laughed it off, said the bank probably flagged it for fraud protection since we'd traveled recently, put it on my card instead without a second thought, and moved on to dessert like nothing had happened. I paid, smiled, didn't mention it again that night. But I checked our joint account balance later, quietly, from the bathroom of that restaurant, and it was fine. Plenty of available credit. Nothing wrong with it at all. Whatever had actually declined, that card wasn't a balance problem. I filed that detail away too, next to the storage unit, next to the 4 wire transfers, next to everything else, and I kept eating my dessert like a woman who hadn't noticed a single thing. My sister called me around this same stretch of time, the way she does most weeks, and asked how things were with Marcus in the easy, half-distracted way you ask a sibling that question when you're mostly just making conversation. I almost told her everything. I had the words lined up, actually sitting right at the back of my throat. Then I thought about what would happen the moment I said it out loud to someone who loved me, how fast it would become real, how fast she'd want me to act before I had anything solid enough to act with. I told her things were fine, busy, the usual. I've since apologized to her for that, more than once. She's told me, more than once, that she understands completely, and that she'd rather have gotten the full story late than gotten half of it early and watched me lose the advantage of surprise. I think she's being generous. I let it comfort me anyway. Then came the trap, though I didn't recognize it as a trap yet. 8 weeks before the kitchen island, Marcus told me he wanted to refinance the house, pull some equity out to, in his words, reinvest in Coastline, and finally get us both the returns he'd been promising for years. I said I wanted to see the full paperwork before anything got signed. He said, of course. And then, I would later learn, quietly scheduled the closing for a week I had an out-of-state work conference already booked and paid for. I found out about the closing date by accident, the way I find out about most things, because I notice what doesn't match. Our mortgage servicer sent a routine courtesy email confirming a payoff quote had been requested on our home loan. I hadn't requested one. Marcus hadn't mentioned a date to me at all. I called the title company myself that same afternoon, gave my name, and asked, very calmly, whether a closing was in fact scheduled for our address. It was, in 4 days. While I was supposed to be 600 miles away at that conference, I did not go to the conference. I told Marcus I had a genuine work emergency and needed to cancel the trip, which, by that point, wasn't entirely a lie. I remember standing in our bedroom that night, unpacking the suitcase I'd already packed, folding the blazer I'd chosen for the keynote panel I was supposed to be sitting on, and thinking, very clearly, that this was the last ordinary night I was going to have for a while. I didn't know yet exactly what I'd find. I only knew that a closing scheduled for a week I'd conveniently be gone was not a coincidence. Not from a man who'd already lied to me about a hotel room and a P.O. box and a woman named Chelsea Whitfield. And on the morning of the closing itself, instead of confronting him directly, I called the title company again and asked, in my professional capacity as someone who reviews closing documents for a living, whether I could get a copy of the fully signed loan package. I told them I was the co-borrower and had a few standard questions about the disclosures. They sent it over without a second thought, because that is a completely ordinary request from a completely ordinary co-borrower on her own loan. I sat in my car in the bank parking lot, coffee in one hand, phone in the other, and I read every single page. My signature was on it, on the deed of trust, on the promissory note, on the right to cancel disclosure required by federal law. 4 signatures, all supposedly mine, all notarized by a woman named Sandra Kwan. I had never met Sandra Kwan in my life. I had never signed a single one of those pages. And I know my own signature, the way I know my own coffee order, because I have spent 11 years professionally comparing signatures for a living. Whoever had signed those pages had gotten close. Not nearly close enough. I pulled Sandra Kwan's notary commission number off the stamp itself, because the number is printed right there in plain view. And I looked it up on our state's public notary registry, the exact way I look up every questionable stamp that crosses my desk at work. Her commission had expired 8 months before the date printed on that closing package. Whoever had notarized my forged signature had used an expired, invalid seal, belonging to a woman who, as it turned out, had left that title company almost a year earlier and moved out of state entirely. That was the moment the file stopped being something I was quietly building for my own peace of mind and became something else entirely. That was the moment I understood that Marcus hadn't just been hiding money from me for years. He had committed outright mortgage fraud, using a forged signature, on our home, using my legal identity, without my knowledge or consent, to fund a company he shared with a woman named Chelsea Whitfield. I called Grant Okafor that same afternoon. Not a family friend, not someone from our usual social circle, but a real estate and fraud attorney I had worked alongside professionally on 2 prior bank cases and trusted completely. I sat across from him in his office and put the file on his desk, all of it, 14 months of careful documentation, and I told him everything I'd found, in order, the way I'd have briefed a compliance committee. He went very quiet, reading through it, longer than I expected, flipping back twice to compare the notary stamp against the registry printout I'd already attached. Then he looked up and asked me a question I hadn't been ready for. "Vivian, do you want to save this marriage? Or do you want to protect yourself and your kids?" I'm not asking to be cruel. I'm asking because the next 3 weeks look very different depending on the answer. I told him the truth, which was that I honestly didn't know yet, and that I wanted options that kept both possibilities open for as long as possible. He nodded, like that was the answer he'd hoped for, and said the sentence that would define the next 3 weeks of my life. "You have a right here that most people never get to use, because most people don't discover a forgery in time. Normally, you'd have 3 business days from a closing to rescind a home loan outright, no reason required. But there's something even more useful buried in what you brought me. Because you were never actually given the required disclosures, because you never received a single accurate document about this loan at all, that 3-day window doesn't apply the normal way here. Under federal lending law, when a lender fails to deliver proper rescission notices to the real homeowner, that window can extend up to 3 full years. Your husband thinks he closed on a loan. What he actually did was create a document that was never properly disclosed to you, which means you can undo the whole thing. Cleanly. Legally. Whenever you're ready to." I asked him what would happen to the equity Marcus had already pulled out and moved into Coastline. Grant said, "If we rescind this properly, the lien comes off the house entirely, and the lender is required to return any money you paid toward it and give up its security interest in the property. Whatever your husband already spent from that draw, he now owes back on the loan personally, with no house behind it to secure the debt anymore. He becomes an unsecured borrower who owes 6 figures on a phantom loan that no longer has any collateral. But Vivian, I need you to hear this part clearly. The moment we file this, if he gets any hint it's coming, he'll try to move faster than we can. We do this quietly, and we do it completely, or we don't do it at all." "And the forgery itself?" I asked. "The notary. Is that something separate?" "It's something separate," Grant said. "It's also something we hold in reserve, not something we lead with. The rescission is civil. It's clean, it's fast, and it doesn't require anyone to prove intent. The forgery is criminal, and criminal referrals move slowly and take on a life of their own once you file them. My advice is we secure the civil relief first, quietly, completely, and then decide together what to do with the rest of it once you're not still living in the same house as the man who signed your name to a mortgage." That was the day the ticking clock actually started, though it was never the clock Marcus thought was running against him. I want to be honest about something, because I think it matters to this story. I didn't rescind the loan that same day. I sat with it for 4 more days, because I needed to be absolutely certain, and because some small, stubborn part of me still wanted there to be an explanation that didn't end our marriage. I looked for one. I genuinely, actively looked. There isn't one. There is no version of "I forged my wife's signature on our mortgage and funneled the proceeds to my girlfriend's company" that ends anywhere other than exactly where this did. On the 5th day, I told Grant to file the rescission. Here's what filing a rescission notice actually looks like, in case you're picturing something dramatic. It's a certified letter. Grant sent it to the lender with copies of the notary registry printout showing the expired commission, a signature exemplar comparison from a forensic document examiner he'd used on prior cases, and a formal notice of rescission citing the federal lending statute by name. It went out on a Tuesday. It would take the lender a matter of weeks to fully process on their end, but the legal effect, Grant told me, was immediate and irreversible the moment it was received. The lien was already, as a matter of law, void from that point forward. Marcus simply didn't know that yet. At the same time, quietly, on the advice of a family law attorney Grant brought in alongside himself, I did one more thing. I had our home's title reviewed for whatever interest I could still legally protect while Marcus and I remained married and the house was still, on paper, jointly owned. 2 weeks before that kitchen island, I signed an interspousal transfer deed, moving my full ownership interest in the house into an irrevocable trust, with our children, Eli and Noah, named as the sole beneficiaries. It is a completely ordinary estate planning tool. People use it every day for reasons that have nothing at all to do with catching a spouse mid-fraud. I recorded it with the county the very next morning. It became a matter of public record that same afternoon, sitting quietly in a database anyone could search if anyone had thought to look. Marcus did not check the county recorder's website. Why would he? As far as he knew, I still believed the refinance was a legitimate business decision he simply hadn't finished explaining to me yet. Stay with me here, because this is where it gets tense. And if you've made it this far, do me a favor and subscribe, because what happens over the next 4 days is the part people ask me to tell them twice. 10 days after I filed the rescission notice, Marcus came home early, and he was different, tighter. He'd clearly heard something from the lender, some early internal notice that a rescission claim had been filed, though not, I'd later learn, that it had already been legally granted in full. He told me over dinner that there was a problem with the refinance, something administrative, and that Coastline had a buyer lined up for a property deal that depended entirely on us moving fast on some paperwork around the house. He said his lawyer, a man named Todd Breyer, whom I'd met exactly twice at holiday parties, thought it would be cleanest if I simply signed the house entirely over to him. Quitclaim, no complications, so Coastline's deal could close without any delay from, and I'm quoting him directly, "joint ownership headaches." I asked him, calmly, what would happen to me and the kids if I did that. He said, and I want you to hear these exact words, because I have never once forgotten them. "You'll be fine, Viv. You always land on your feet. That's kind of the problem." "That's not an answer," I said. "It's the only one you're getting tonight," he said, and reached for his wine like the conversation was already over. I did not react the way he expected. I said I'd think about it overnight. I got up from the table, made myself a cup of coffee, black, no sugar, scalding hot, and I stood at the kitchen window for a long time, watching nothing in particular, while behind me Marcus scrolled his phone and hummed a little, like a man who believed the hardest part of his week was already over. 3 days later, Chelsea Whitfield's name came up again. This time not in a filing, but in a text message that lit up Marcus's phone while it sat face up on the counter and he was in the shower. I am not proud of reading it. I am also not going to pretend I felt much guilt about it for very long. The message, from a contact saved simply as C, read, "Told Todd we need this closed by Thursday. My investor pulls out if the property's not fully clear by Friday morning. Tell her whatever you need to tell her." That was the moment I finally understood the full shape of what was happening. Marcus wasn't just hiding an affair or hiding money from me. He and Chelsea were planning to sell a piece of property Coastline supposedly owned, using equity pulled from a fraudulently refinanced house, and he needed my name completely off the title, fast, before anyone looked too closely at where that equity had actually come from. He needed a clean, cooperative, non-asking wife to sign a quitclaim deed by Thursday before Friday's deadline. Diane's little bell rang right on cue in my memory. A good wife doesn't ask questions. I called Grant that night and told him everything Chelsea's text had said, word for word. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said something I've thought about often since. Vivian, he's about to hand you the exact leverage you need, and he's going to do it himself, in front of witnesses, because he genuinely believes you're the only person in this entire situation who doesn't know what's really going on. Let him. Thursday came. Marcus asked me to meet him at the house at 6, said Todd would stop by with paperwork, said it would take 5 minutes, said we could still make it to Diane's birthday dinner by 7:30 if I simply signed and didn't overthink it the way I overthink everything. His words, not mine. I want to take you back to that kitchen island now, because you already know how it starts. He slid the quitclaim deed across the counter. He told me he was taking the house, the kids, and everything else. I signed it without reading a single word, because by that point I already knew something he didn't. The house, as collateral for the refinance he'd forged, no longer had a valid lien on it at all, and my own ownership share in that house didn't belong to me personally anymore, in any way a simple quitclaim deed could reach. It belonged entirely to an irrevocable trust for our children, recorded with the county 2 weeks earlier, a matter of complete public record that any title company doing basic due diligence would find inside of 4 minutes. Grant's text came in right then. Do not sign anything until we talk. I saw it. I set my phone face down on the counter, and I asked Marcus, quite calmly, whether he'd told Todd about the trust yet. He asked, genuinely confused, what trust? I told him to ask his lawyer. Friday morning arrived, the exact deadline Chelsea's investor had given. But let me walk you through the days between the signing and that morning first, because they mattered more than any single one of them looked like it did at the time. Day 1. Marcus came home in a noticeably better mood than he'd been in for weeks, humming while he made himself a drink, telling me he'd already forwarded the signed quitclaim to Todd and that everything was, quote, moving in the right direction now. I asked no questions. I made my coffee, black, no sugar, scalding hot, and went to bed early. Day 2. Diane called to confirm what time we'd all be arriving for her birthday dinner the following week, mentioning, almost as an aside, that Marcus had told her the property thing was finally resolved and that they could stop worrying about it. I told her I was looking forward to celebrating. That part, at least, was true. Day 3, a Thursday, was the night of the actual signing at the kitchen island, the one I already told you about. And it was only after that night, once Marcus had gone to bed, satisfied and unaware, that the real clock I'd been quietly running for 3 weeks finally caught up to the one he thought he controlled. Because by the time he woke up Friday morning to drive to Meridian Title and Escrow, the rescission grant had filed 16 days earlier had already been fully processed by the lender for 6 full days. The lien had already been legally dead for the better part of a week. He was about to walk into a closing to sell a property with equity from a loan that, as far as the law was concerned, had already ceased to exist. Marcus, Todd, Diane, and Chelsea, who I gather insisted on being present because 6 figures of her own investors' money depended on this closing going through, all met at Meridian Title and Escrow at 9 sharp to finalize the sale of the newly cleared property. I wasn't invited. I went anyway, with Grant beside me, because as it turns out, when your name sits on a trust that legally owns the underlying property interest, you have every right in the world to be in that room. I remember sitting in the waiting area of that title company, coffee in hand, black, no sugar, scalding hot, watching Marcus through the glass conference room wall as he shook hands with people, laughed at something Todd said, looked, for all the world, like a man about to close the biggest deal of his career. Diane sat beside him in a blazer she'd clearly chosen for the occasion. Chelsea arrived 4 minutes late, apologized to no one in particular, and took the seat directly across from where Marcus had left an open chair, which told me everything about the seating chart of his actual life that I still needed to know. Grant leaned over and said, quietly, "Whenever you're ready." I finished my coffee first. Some habits you keep for a reason. The escrow officer, a patient, unbothered woman named Renata, who had absolutely no idea what she was walking into that morning, pulled the title report to confirm everything was in order before releasing any funds. It wasn't in order. It hadn't been in order for 2 full weeks. The report showed an irrevocable trust holding the full ownership interest in the residential property, recorded and entirely public, naming 2 minor children as sole beneficiaries, with a trustee, me, who had never authorized any sale, any quitclaim, or any transfer of the underlying interest to Marcus at all. Stacked directly on top of that, the deed of trust securing the very refinance that had supposedly funded Coastline's equity had already been formally rescinded under federal lending law due to a forged signature and an expired notary commission, meaning the lien the lender believed it held on the property was, as a matter of law, entirely void. Renata looked up from her screen and said, in the gentlest, most devastating sentence I have ever heard a total stranger say to a room full of people, "I'm going to need everyone to hold on a moment. This title isn't clear. It looks like it hasn't been clear since sometime before this closing was even scheduled." I watched Todd Breyer's face change first, because attorneys always see it before anyone else in the room does. He asked to see the trust document. Renata slid it across the table. He read the recording date twice. He looked over at Marcus. Marcus looked at me. "Vivian!" Marcus said, and his voice had lost the calm, stake-ordering register I'd heard my whole marriage. "What did you do?" "I documented," I said. "That's all. You told me I didn't have to ask questions, so I stopped asking, and I started writing everything down instead." Chelsea, to her credit, was the one who said the sentence that actually ended the meeting. "Marcus, what is this?" He turned to her first, before he even finished turning back to me, and something in that half second told me everything I needed to know about where his loyalty had actually been living for the last 18 months. He tried, briefly, to argue that the quitclaim deed I'd signed the night before superseded whatever Grant was describing. Grant, standing quietly beside me, calmly pointed out that you cannot quitclaim an ownership interest you no longer legally hold, and that I had signed away nothing more than a piece of paper describing a share that, by that point, belonged to a trust and not to me personally at all. He also, without raising his voice even once, mentioned the forged signature, the expired notary commission, and the rescission notice already on file with the lender, all of which he had brought copies of, all of which he now handed across the table to Todd Breyer, one attorney to another, entirely as a professional courtesy. Todd read the notary registry printout for a long moment, then set it down and said, quietly, to Marcus, "We need to step outside." Marcus didn't move. He was still looking at me like I was the one who'd broken something. Diane, who had come along that morning expecting to celebrate a real estate closing and a family win, sat very still through all of it. I remember her looking over at me and starting to say something. I remember beating her to it. I said, quietly, "A good wife doesn't ask questions, Diane." So I stopped asking. I just started documenting instead. Nobody in that room had anything left to say back to that. Renata, to her enormous credit, simply closed her folder, thanked everyone for their time, and said the closing would need to be rescheduled indefinitely, pending resolution of the title defect. I have never seen 6 figures of somebody else's investment money evaporate that quietly or that fast. The closing did not happen. Chelsea's investor pulled out within the hour, precisely as she'd texted she would if the property wasn't fully clear by Friday morning, except now it was Marcus's own affair partner walking away from his deal because of paperwork he'd hidden from his wife for over a year. Coastline Capital Partners defaulted on its operating line of credit 6 weeks later, once the bank doing its own routine review noticed the same structuring pattern I'd flagged 14 months earlier, now stacked directly on top of a federal lending fraud complaint Grant had already filed with the appropriate Consumer Protection Division. I want to be clear that I didn't file that complaint using any access from my job at Ridgeline. I filed it as a private citizen whose legal identity had been used without her consent, which is precisely what it was. The mortgage lender, once the rescission was fully processed on their end, released its lien entirely and refunded every dollar of interest and fees Marcus and I had paid toward that loan since the fraudulent closing. Marcus was left personally owing the full equity amount he'd already spent and moved to Coastline, over $200,000, now sitting as an unsecured personal debt with no house behind it and no functioning business left to generate the income to pay it down. Chelsea, I later learned through Diane, who by that point had started quietly telling me things she probably shouldn't have, moved her investor relationship to a different developer within a month, and stopped returning Marcus's calls entirely about 6 weeks after the title company. Whatever they had, it turned out to be a great deal more conditional on his solvency than either of them had ever admitted to themselves. Todd Breyer, for his part, sent Grant a professional, carefully worded letter 2 months later indicating he was withdrawing as Marcus's counsel over what he described only as irreconcilable conflicts regarding disclosure. I understood exactly what that meant, even in lawyer language. Marcus had not been fully honest with his own attorney either, which tells you something about the kind of year he was actually living through underneath all that confidence. Ridgeline, once the structuring pattern surfaced through the same routine review process that had first put Coastline on my radar 14 months earlier, closed the business line of credit entirely and referred the file to the appropriate federal reporting channel, exactly as bank policy requires for any confirmed structuring pattern, regardless of whose husband happens to be attached to the account. I recused myself from any involvement in that referral the moment Coastline's name came up in a meeting, because I have spent 11 years building a career on doing this correctly, and I was not about to let one very bad year undo 11 very careful ones. Diane called me 11 days after that Friday at the title company. Not to apologize, not exactly, but to ask, in a smaller voice than I'd ever once heard her use in the 8 years I'd known her, whether I thought Marcus was going to be all right. I told her the truth. I told her I hoped he would be, eventually, and that hoping that had absolutely nothing to do with whether I was willing to hand him anything else in order to get there. Eli asked me, about a month into all of this, why Dad wasn't living with us anymore. I told him the truth in the smallest, gentlest version I could manage. I said Dad had made some very serious grown-up mistakes with money that hurt our family, and that grown-ups, just like kids, have to deal with real consequences when they do that, and that none of it was anything he or his sister had done or could have prevented. He thought about that for a while, in the specific way 9-year-olds think about things, and then asked if he could still have pancakes on Saturdays. I told him absolutely, every single Saturday. That part wasn't changing no matter what else did. 3 weeks after that Friday, the divorce filing was finalized on terms that looked almost nothing like the ones Marcus had slid across our kitchen island. The house, held in trust for Eli and Noah, stays in trust for Eli and Noah, with me serving as trustee until they're both adults. Marcus kept his personal debt, all of it, entirely his own, with no house or business left to shield him from it. I kept primary custody, because a man in the middle of a federal lending complaint and a defaulted business line of credit does not, in practice, spend much time fighting a court over weekday mornings with a 9-year-old and a 6-year-old. I did agree to one thing, on my own terms, not his and not Diane's. Diane can see her grandchildren on a schedule I set myself, supervised at first, because trust, in this family, turned out to be something you rebuild in small, verified increments over time, not something you're simply handed for free because someone reminds you often enough that it's what a good woman does. She's kept every single visit so far without exception. She's stopped saying the phrase entirely, as far as I can tell, though I notice she still catches herself sometimes, mid-sentence, like an old habit her mouth hasn't fully unlearned yet. I notice things like that. It's the job. And I don't think it will ever stop being the job. Marcus, for what it's worth, reached out once, about 4 months after the title company, asking if we could talk without lawyers, just the two of us, like old times. I told him old times were exactly the problem, and that any conversation we needed to have could happen through Grant and his new attorney, whoever that ended up being. He hasn't asked again since. I hear, secondhand, through Diane, that he's working again, some smaller operation, no LLC of his own name attached this time, and that Chelsea is not part of it. I feel less about that than I expected to feel. Mostly, I just feel like a woman who finally got her Saturdays back. I've thought a lot, since all of this settled, about what I would tell 29-year-old me, standing at that engagement dinner hearing Diane's little bell for the very first time. I don't think I'd tell her to leave. I don't think the lesson here is that every charming man with a vague business plan is secretly building a second life behind a locked office door. Most of them aren't. I'd tell her something smaller and, I think, more useful. I'd tell her that the moment someone hands you a rule about who isn't allowed to ask questions, the rule itself is the information. Pay attention to who benefits from your silence, and you will generally find out everything else you need to know eventually on your own schedule, in your own time. Here's what I actually learned from all of this, and I say this not as a lawyer, because I'm not one, but as the person who spent 11 years learning to notice what doesn't match. Betrayal rarely announces itself with a shout. It arrives quietly, in a mismatched statement, an expired stamp, A phrase repeated just often enough that you eventually stop hearing it as a warning and start hearing it as a lullaby instead. A good wife doesn't ask questions. I believed that, for a while, longer than I'm proud to admit out loud. But asking questions was never the opposite of trust. It was the only thing that ever actually protected the people I trusted most, which is to say, my children and, in the end, myself as well. I think about that coffee cup a lot, honestly, more than makes sense for a paper cup you throw away every single morning. Black, no sugar, scalding hot, held with both hands in a parking lot while the rest of my life quietly rearranged itself around me. I never once raised my voice through any of this. I never needed to. The letter did the shouting. The recorded deed did the shouting. A patient escrow officer named Renata, reading a title report out loud to a room that had no idea what it was about to hear, did more shouting in one gentle sentence than I could have managed in a year of screaming. I still get that same coffee every morning, at the same shop, on my way to a job I still love, doing work I still believe matters, even on the days it costs me something personal to do it correctly. Eli still gets his pancakes every Saturday. Noah has started asking for extra whipped cream on hers, which I allow because some negotiations are worth losing on purpose. I didn't win by yelling in that kitchen, or slamming a door, or making one single dramatic scene in front of anyone. I won 3 weeks earlier, quietly, with a certified letter and a recorded deed, while everyone around me assumed a good wife was still just sitting at home, not asking questions, patiently waiting to sign whatever got put in front of her next. If this story meant something to you, tell me in the comments where you're watching from, and whether you've ever had to stay quiet on purpose while you built the exact thing that would finally speak for you when it mattered most. Share it with someone who needs to hear that competence is its own kind of justice. And if you haven't already, go ahead and subscribe, because these stories keep coming, and I'll see you in the next one.